Welcome. Close your eyes, or simply let your gaze soften. We are about to journey not just into the life of a great philosopher, but into the single, devastating moment that tore his world apart and birthed a foundation for all Western thought. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know your city and local time in the comments so we can see where everyone is listening from. This is the story of Plato, a man haunted by a question so profound, so terrifying, that it would consume him for 5 decades. What is justice? To find the answer, we must first confront the ultimate injustice. We begin in the spring of 399 BC, in the very heart of Athens, the cradle of democracy, the promised land of intellectual freedom. Yet, beneath the glorious marble temples, a tragedy of unimaginable magnitude was unfolding. A young nobleman named Plato stood in that dense, claustrophobic courtroom, a stunned witness to the unimaginable. The man acknowledged by the Oracle of Delphi as the wisest in the world, his teacher, Socrates, was being condemned to death. Think about that paradox. The wisest man in the most enlightened city was to be executed, not for treason, theft, or murder, but for the most radical of crimes, the crime of asking questions. The charge, corrupting the youth and impiety, failing to acknowledge the city's gods. This was the moment that didn't just shock Plato. It shattered his entire perception of reality. The democracy he had hoped to serve had just killed the very soul of reason. The foundation of his world was gone, and in its place, a consuming void opened in his mind, demanding to know. How could the search for truth lead to a death sentence? This question, this powerful, haunting contradiction, is the promise of our journey tonight. We will not merely recount Plato's life, we will trace his relentless 50-year pursuit of an answer to that initial devastating trauma. To truly feel the weight of this event, we must understand the atmosphere in which it occurred. Athens was not the glorious, triumphant city of Pericles. It was a wounded beast. They had just lost the catastrophic Peloponnesian War against Sparta, a decades-long conflict that drained their wealth, their spirit, and their pride. Their democracy had been briefly, violently overthrown by a brutal oligarchic regime. A regime that, ironically, included several of Plato's own relatives, like Critias and Charmides. The city was paranoid, desperate for a scapegoat, and craving someone to blame for the collapse of their once great empire. In that dark, heavy air, Socrates, with his inconvenient truth-telling, became the perfect sacrifice. The trial itself was a masterpiece of high-stakes drama and profound philosophical resistance. By tradition, an accused man could save himself by begging, weeping, or bringing his children forward to appeal to the jurist's pity. But Socrates refused to do any of it. He was a man of unyielding integrity, and he understood that to beg for his life would be to validate the accusation that his philosophical mission, the examined life, was something shameful. Instead, he stood before the 501 jurors with a demeanor that Plato would later immortalize: calm, rational, and most aggravatingly, utterly cheerful. This was the dramatic climax. This was the moment of ultimate defiance. Not only did Socrates refuse to plead for mercy, but he demanded honor. He argued that he was owed the highest public distinction Athens could bestow: free maintenance and meals for life at the Prytaneum, a privilege usually reserved for Olympic champions and national heroes. His justification was searing. He had spent his life not training muscles, but improving the citizens of Athens, like a persistent, annoying gadfly, stinging a great, lazy horse, Athens, to wake it from its sleep. For this vital public service, he deserved not punishment, but eternal gratitude. This brazen contempt for the legal proceedings, this demand for a crown when he faced the executioner, was too much for the wounded pride of the Athenian jury. They were ready to be swayed, but not to be mocked. The initial vote on his guilt was close, a mere 280 votes to convict, against 220 for acquittal. Socrates was guilty, but only by a whisker. Had he shown even a hint of remorse, had he suggested a lesser, reasonable punishment, exile perhaps, or a modest fine, he would have almost certainly walked free. But after hearing his outrageous demand for a public feast, the jurors' fury cemented. The subsequent vote on the punishment was a staggering rejection, 360 votes for death. This is the crucial, electrifying detail. Many more jurors voted for his execution than had voted him guilty in the first place. Socrates, through his unwavering philosophical pride, had forced the community to utterly reject his entire life's work. He had, in a sense, signed his own death warrant by refusing to compromise the truth. The dramatic tension peaked when Socrates accepted the verdict with a profoundly unsettling serenity, declaring his most famous dictum, "The unexamined life is not worth living." For Plato, this moment was the forge. It was the absolute proof that the unbridled power of politics, the whim of the many, was fundamentally incompatible with the unwavering pursuit of philosophy and truth. This traumatic event, this searing image of the wisest and most moral man drinking the hemlock, became the obsessive driving force behind every dialogue Plato would ever write. It pushed him away from his early political ambitions and onto a desperate, lifelong quest to design the perfect society, the republic, where such an unjust execution could never happen again. And the drama of his life did not end there. Driven by his ideals, Plato later attempted to advise the tyrant Dionysius, only to be betrayed and sold into slavery. A jarring encounter that further cemented the idea that the philosopher must stand apart from the corrupting influence of power. From the trauma of Socrates' death to his own brush with servitude, Plato dedicated his life to building a fortress of reason, a world of transcendent forms that was untouchable by the fickle brutality of the physical world. This is the man whose legacy we explore tonight. A legacy born from an impossible paradox, that the greatest democratic system the world had ever known could destroy its most valuable citizen. As we now settle into the world of Plato, let this foundational injustice be your guide. Let the question echo softly in the background of your thoughts. What price are we willing to pay for truth? And what is the true nature of the justice that escaped Socrates? Allow the ancient world to unfold before you and prepare for a long, reflective peace. And now, the final scene of this tragedy plays out not in a courtroom, but in a small stone-walled cell carved into the Hill of the Muses. The air here is cool, smelling faintly of damp earth and the distant briny scent of the Aegean Sea carried on the evening breeze. It has been a month since the trial, a strange, suspended month of waiting. By a quirk of religious law, no executions were permitted while the sacred ship of Delos was at sea, commemorating the legendary voyage of Theseus. It is a historical irony that the city which killed reason was forced to wait for a myth to conclude before doing so. But today, the ship has returned. It sails heavy with the salt of the pilgrimage. The sun is setting over the Acropolis, casting long bruised shadows of violet and grey across the prison floor. Plato is not here. He lies ill at home, feverish with grief and helplessness, a detail he would later meticulously record, perhaps to spare himself the sight of the end, or perhaps because the body sometimes breaks when the spirit cannot bear the weight of what it sees. But we are here. We watch as the jailer, a man who has grown fond of the gentle philosopher, weeps openly while grinding the hemlock. The poison is thick, a dark, murky green in the clay cup. There is no struggle, no wailing. Socrates takes the cup as if it were a libation of wine at a banquet. He speaks of a debt owed to Asclepius, the god of healing, a rooster, a small everyday offering, suggesting that death is not a sickness, but a cure for the sickness of life. He drinks. He walks until his legs feel heavy, like stone pillars settling into the earth. Then he lies down. The numbness creeps upward, from feet to calves, turning the warm, vibrant flesh into cold marble. The twilight deepens. The chatter of the city outside fades into a respectful hush. Or perhaps that is just the silence filling the room. The gadfly of Athens is still. The great noise of democracy has won its victory. But in the deepening dark, the silence left behind is deafening, demanding an answer that will echo for thousands of years. To understand the depth of the shadow cast by that prison cell, we must turn back the wheel of time, retreating from the darkness of 389 BC into the golden, sun-drenched haze of a childhood spent not in the library, but in the dust of the wrestling ring. Before he was the father of Western philosophy, before he was the scribe of Socrates, he was simply a boy named Aristocles. It is a name that sounds strange to our ears now, heavy with formal expectation, meaning best reputation. A fitting title for a child born into the very highest echelon of Athenian aristocracy. Imagine a young man, not stooped over scrolls, but standing tall in the palestra, the wrestling school, his skin glistening with olive oil, the hot Mediterranean sun baking the sand beneath his feet. This is the image of Plato we rarely see, the athlete. The air here smells of crushed herbs, sweat, and the distinct dry scent of clay dust used to grip the opponent's skin. In the ancient Greek world, the mind and the body were not enemies. They were twin pillars of a perfect temple. To train the mind without the body was to be soft. To train the body without the mind was to be savage. Young Aristocles was determined to be neither. He was built like a bull, with a chest so wide and shoulders so expansive that his wrestling coach, a man of few words and much grit, supposedly looked at him and grunted a new name, Platon. In Greek, Platus means broad. It was a nickname, a locker room moniker that stuck. Historians still argue whether this story is true or merely a charming legend. Some scholars suggest Plato was actually a fairly common name in Athens, not just a description of his physique, while others insist it referred to the breadth of his forehead, or even the breadth of his eloquent style. But there is something wonderfully grounding in the idea that the greatest thinker of all time carried a name that essentially meant broad shoulders, a perpetual reminder of his days grappling in the sand. It is a gentle, humanizing thought that before he wrestled with the forms of the good and the beautiful, he was simply wrestling with other sweaty teenagers, trying not to get thrown on his back. And he was good at it. Legend whispers that he even competed at the Isthmian Games, a venue second only to the Olympics, where the roar of the crowd would have been a physical force vibrating in the chest. Picture him there, breathing hard, the adrenaline sharp and metallic in his mouth, unaware that his true arena would not be one of sand, but of ideas. But muscle was only half of his inheritance. Aristocles was born into a lineage that felt less like a family tree and more like a history book. On his father's side, he traced his blood back to Codrus, the last semi-mythical king of Athens who sacrificed himself to save the city. On his mother's side, he was related to Solon, the great lawgiver who laid the foundations of Athenian democracy. In a city obsessed with ancestry, Plato was royalty in everything but title. He grew up in a household where the walls echoed with political strategy and the weight of governance. It was simply assumed, as naturally as the sun rises in the east, that he would enter politics. To be a young man of his station and not lead the city would be like a bird refusing to fly, an absurdity. His education was the finest money could buy, a rigorous curriculum of musike, which meant far more than just music. It was the realm of the muses, covering poetry, history, and literature, and gymnastic, the training of the physical form. We can imagine him in the music room, his large, restless fingers delicately plucking the strings of a lyre, learning the mathematical precision of harmony. This is a crucial historical truth woven into the fabric of his life. For the Greeks, music was not just entertainment, it was a moral discipline. A discordant note wasn't just a mistake, it was a character flaw. The order of the notes reflected the order of the cosmos, a lesson that would sink deep into Plato's subconscious, lying dormant until he began to write about the harmony of the spheres decades later. Yet inside this broad-shouldered athlete and dutiful aristocrat, there was a restless, artistic fire. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to create. In his late teens, Plato fancied himself a tragedian. He wrote dithyrambs, wild choral hymns to Dionysus, and tragedies, dreaming of winning the prize at the great Dionysia festival. We can picture him sitting up late by the light of an oil lamp, the flame flickering against the painted plaster walls, scratching verses onto wax tablets, convinced he was the next Aeschylus. It is a tender image of youthful vanity, the future philosopher worrying about meter and rhyme, perhaps reading his lines aloud to a polite but skeptical slave. There is a quiet humor in imagining the stern, metaphysical Plato of later years looking back at his teenage self, overflowing with melodramatic angst and bad poetry. But this artistic ambition tells us something vital. He possessed a soul sensitive to beauty and narrative. He understood the power of a story to enchant the mind. When he eventually turned to philosophy, he didn't leave the poet behind. He absorbed him. This is why his dialogues are not dry academic treatises, but living conversations, full of characters, myths, and dramatic settings. He never stopped being a dramatist. He just changed the stage. The world of his youth, however, was not all lyres and wrestling matches. It was a world fraying at the edges. While he was memorizing Homer and practicing his hip throws, the golden age of Athens was bleeding out. He was born just after the death of Pericles, the great statesman who had defined the city's glory. Plato never knew the Athens of total confidence. He only knew the Athens of the long, grinding war. The Peloponnesian War against Sparta was the background noise of his entire childhood, a constant, low-frequency hum of anxiety. He would have seen the countryside refugees crowding into the space between the long walls, smelling the smoke of burning olive groves as Spartan raiders torched the fields of Attica. He would have heard the older men arguing at the dinner table about lost battles and shifting alliances. It was a time of slow, creeping disillusionment. The gods seemed silent, and the politicians seemed loud. The contrast between the orderly, beautiful world of his music lessons and the chaotic, violent world outside the window must have been jarring. It created a fissure in his mind, a longing for a stability that the physical world refused to provide. He was a young man with a wrestler's strength, a poet's heart, and a politician's pedigree, waiting for a spark to ignite the dry tinder of his potential. He walked the streets of Athens in his fine cloak, perhaps a bit arrogant, perhaps a bit lost, looking for a teacher who could explain why the world was breaking. He tried the teachings of Cratylus, a follower of Heraclitus, who believed that everything is in constant flux, that you cannot step into the same river twice. It was an unsettling philosophy, suggesting that reality was like water slipping through one's fingers. It offered no anchor, only endless drift. Aristocles needed something solid. He needed a truth that didn't move. And then one day, perhaps while cutting through the agora on his way to the theatre, or perhaps lounging near a banker's table, listening to the gossip, he heard a voice. It wasn't a beautiful voice. It belonged to a man who looked nothing like the bronze statues of heroes Plato admired. This man was short, pot-bellied, with bulging eyes and a snub nose, a face that looked more like a satyr than a sage. But the words he spoke cut through the noise of the market like a razor through silk. He wasn't talking about money or war or the price of fish. He was asking a young man with infuriating politeness what it meant to be good. Aristocles stopped. The crowd shifted. The broad-shouldered aristocrat drew closer to the barefoot stonemason. The poet locked eyes with the dialectician. In that silence, the wrestling match of his life began, not against a physical opponent, but against the lazy assumptions of his own mind. The boy named Aristocles was about to vanish, and Plato, the student of Socrates, was about to be born. To truly understand the architecture of Plato's mind, his obsession with perfect order, his distrust of the chaotic physical world, and his longing for a republic ruled by wisdom rather than impulse, we must walk the streets of the city that raised him. But we must strip away the romantic postcard image of Athens. Forget for a moment the serene white columns gleaming under a peaceful blue sky. The Athens of Plato's childhood was a fortress under siege, a pressure cooker of humanity trapped behind stone. He was born around 427 BC, just a few years after the Great Peloponnesian War began. This means that for the first 23 years of his life, Plato never knew a world at peace. Peace was a story the old men told, a myth as distant as the Golden Fleece. His reality was the war. It was the wallpaper of his existence, the constant low-grade fever of a society locked in a death grip with Sparta. To the young Aristocles, the boundaries of the world were defined by the long walls, those two massive parallel fortifications that stretched for 4 miles, connecting the city of Athens to its port, Piraeus. These walls were the city's lifeline, a stone umbilical cord that allowed the Athenian navy to bring in grain from the Black Sea, while the Spartans prowled the countryside outside. Imagine the sensory experience of a boy growing up in this cage. The strategy of the great leader Pericles had been to pull the entire population of Attica, the farmers, the shepherds, the villagers, inside the walls to protect them from the Spartan infantry. It was a brilliant strategic move, but a humanitarian nightmare. The city was packed tight. The graceful squares were filled with makeshift shacks and tents. The air would have been thick, heavy with the smoke of cooking fires from thousands of refugees, the smell of unwashed bodies, and the anxious murmur of a displaced people. When Plato looked out from the roof of his family's noble estate, he wouldn't see the rolling olive groves of his ancestors. He would see the smoke rising from the hills where the Spartans were methodically burning the farms, torching the sacred olive trees that took generations to grow. The Spartans were the monsters under the bed for an entire generation of Athenian children. Grim, humorless warriors who lived on a diet of black broth so unappetizing that a visiting Sybarite once joked, "Now I know why the Spartans are so willing to die. Who would want to live if they had to eat this?" It is a small, dark joke, but it highlights the cultural chasm. The grim discipline of Sparta circling the vibrant, chaotic, crumbling democracy of Athens. But the Spartans were not the deadliest enemy. The true horror, the shadow that lay over Plato's cradle, was invisible. Just before his birth, and recurring throughout his childhood, a devastating plague swept through the overcrowded city. It remains one of history's great medical mysteries. Historians and pathologists still argue fiercely over what exactly the plague of Athens was. Some say typhus, others smallpox, and recent DNA evidence from ancient teeth suggests it might have been an ancestral form of typhoid fever. Whatever its name, its impact was apocalyptic. It killed perhaps a third of the population, including Pericles himself. It tore the social fabric apart. Thucydides, the historian who survived it, wrote that men ceased to fear the gods or the laws, spending their money on wild pleasures because they expected to be dead by morning. Young Plato grew up in the emotional hangover of this catastrophe. He walked streets where every family was missing a father, a brother, or a child. He saw a society that had looked into the abyss and lost its moral compass. This is the crucial psychological context for his philosophy. Plato didn't hate the physical world because he was a grumpy intellectual. He distrusted it because he had seen how fragile it was. He had seen the strongest bodies wither from disease and the greatest city descend into lawless panic. When he later wrote about the world of forms, a perfect, unchangeable, eternal realm where a circle is always round and justice never dies, he wasn't just engaging in abstract logic. He was building a psychological refuge. He was constructing a mental fortress where the plague couldn't reach, where the Spartans couldn't burn the crops, and where the chaos of a crowded, frightened city could be silenced by the cool, clean lines of reason. It is poignant to think of him as a boy, perhaps standing near the Dipylon gate, watching the weary hoplites return from patrol, their armor dented and dull. He belonged to a class that was supposed to lead this city, but the city seemed ungovernable. The democracy, in its desperation, became fickle and cruel, executing its own generals after the naval battle of Arginusae because a storm prevented them from rescuing survivors. Plato saw the mob in action, terrified people making terrible decisions. This chaos likely drove him closer to his family's conservative circles. Men who whispered that democracy was a mistake, that the rule of the few, the best men, was the only way to restore order. It is an uncomfortable truth that Plato's early sympathies lay with the oligarchs, the aristocrats, who promised stability. Can we blame him? In a world of fire and plague, order is the most seductive promise of all. Yet, amidst this grim reality, there were flashes of the resilience that defines the human spirit. The festivals continued. The tragedies were still performed in the theatre of Dionysus, where the citizens gathered to weep over the fates of mythical kings, perhaps finding catharsis for their own suffering. The dialectic continued in the gymnasium, and somewhere in that crowded, noisy, smoky city, the young wrestler began to listen less to the shouts of the politicians and more to the quiet questions of the uglier man in the marketplace. The war had stripped away the illusion that wealth or walls could save you. It prepared the soil of Plato's mind for a different kind of seed. He began to realize that if the physical world was a place of constant decay, where empires fall, bodies rot, and laws are broken, then the truth must lie somewhere else. It must lie in the invisible. The war taught him that the only walls that truly hold are the walls of the mind. As the war dragged to its humiliating close in 404 BC, with Athens starving and finally surrendering to Sparta, the physical walls of the city were torn down to the sound of flutes, a Spartan demand to humiliate their defeated foe. Plato was roughly 23 years old. He watched the stone fortifications crumble. The very stones that had defined his world turned to rubble. It was the end of the Athenian Empire. But for Plato, it was the beginning of a reconstruction project that would outlast every wall in Greece. He would not rebuild with stone. He would rebuild with thoughts. And as the dust settled over the defeated city, a new battle was forming, not between armies, but for the soul of the young aristocrat who stood in the ruins, wondering what, if anything, was permanent. Let us step now out of the shadows of the war and into the bright, chaotic sunlight of the Athenian agora. It is the beating heart of the city, a sprawling, dusty square framed by colonnades, where the business of life is conducted at full volume. Imagine the soundscape, a cacophony of fishmongers shouting the price of eels, bankers clinking drachmas on wooden tables, and politicians practicing their speeches near the monument of the eponymous heroes. The air is thick with the scent of roasting garlic, sweat, and the pungent tang of curing leather. Through this sensory riot walks a young man who seems to float slightly above it all. It is Aristocles, our Plato, now in his late teens. He is a striking figure, his broad shoulders draped in a cloak of fine Milesian wool, dyed a deep, rich color that signals his wealth without screaming it. He moves with the easy, languid confidence of a predator who has never known hunger, flanked, perhaps, by a gaggle of admirers or fellow aristocrats. He is handsome, wealthy, and bored. He has studied with the best sophists, those paid teachers who taught the art of winning arguments regardless of the truth. But their verbal tricks feel hollow to him, like eating wax fruit, beautiful to look at, but offering no sustenance. He is looking for something, though he cannot name it. He clutches a scroll of his own tragic poetry, his latest attempt to rival Sophocles, convinced that his destiny lies in the theatre. But fate has prepared a different kind of stage for him today. In a shaded corner of the agora, near the stall of a cobbler, a small crowd has gathered. They are not cheering. They are laughing, but it is a nervous, uncomfortable laughter. Plato pushes through the ring of onlookers, expecting to see a juggler or a fire eater. Instead, he sees a troll. There is no other way to describe him. The man in the center of the circle is aggressively ugly by Athenian standards. He has a flat, pug nose with wide, flaring nostrils, eyes that bulge out like a crab's, and a thick, unkempt beard. He is barefoot, his feet calloused from walking on the hot stones, and he wears a single, threadbare cloak that he wears summer and winter, a garment that has likely not seen a wash basin in weeks. This is Socrates, the son of a stonemason and a midwife, a man who claims to possess no wisdom at all, yet somehow manages to make the most powerful men in the city look like fools. Plato watches, amused at first. Socrates is talking to a renowned general, perhaps Laches or Nicias, men covered in the glory of war. The general is speaking of courage with great bluster, using big, heavy words. Socrates listens, head cocked to the side, looking for all the world like a confused simpleton. Then, with a gentle, almost apologetic tone, he asks a simple question. But surely, noble general, if courage is standing one's ground, what of the Scythian horsemen who fight by retreating? Are they not courageous? The general blinks. He stammers. He tries to redefine his terms. Socrates smiles, not cruelly, but encouragingly, and asks another question, and another. Bit by bit, the general's definition falls apart. The courage he thought he understood dissolves into contradictions. The crowd titters. The general flushes red, stripped of his intellectual armor in front of a bunch of shoemakers and idlers. Plato is transfixed. He has seen men argue to win, but he has never seen a man argue to understand. He has never seen someone dismantle a concept so completely, leaving nothing but a clean, empty space where a false belief used to be. This is the elenchus, the Socratic method of cross-examination, and to young Plato, it is more thrilling than any wrestling match. It is a combat of souls. We can imagine the moment Socrates turns his bulging eyes toward the young aristocrat. The physical contrast is almost comical. The beautiful, broad-shouldered youth in silk and the barefoot, snub-nosed old man in rags. It is the meeting of Apollo and Silenus. Legend tells us that Socrates had a dream the night before this meeting. He dreamt a baby swan flew into his lap, let out a magnificent cry, and flew away. When he saw Plato, he reportedly whispered, "This is the swan." But for Plato, the experience was less like a bird taking flight and more like being stung. He would later compare Socrates to a stingray, the torpedo fish that numbs its victims with an electric shock. Plato felt that numbness now. All his polished education, his memorized speeches, his tragic verses, under Socrates' gaze, they felt heavy and useless. Socrates didn't want to teach him facts. He wanted to show him that he knew nothing. This is the great paradox of their relationship, and indeed, a central tension in history. Socrates wrote nothing, not a single word. He believed that writing was a dead thing, that books could not answer back if you asked them a question. He believed philosophy only happened in the living breath of conversation. So, we are left with a ghost. Almost everything we know about this barefoot sage comes from the pen of the man standing before him now. It is a historical mirror maze. Are we hearing Socrates, or are we hearing Plato's memory of him? Historians still argue endlessly about the Socratic problem, where the real Socrates ends and Plato's literary character begins. But in this moment, in the dust of the market, the distinction doesn't matter. What matters is the spark. Socrates introduced a metaphor that would stick in Plato's mind forever: the gadfly. He described Athens as a great, noble, but sluggish horse, a powerful beast that had grown fat and lazy from its own success. "I am the gadfly," Socrates would say with a twinkle in his eye, "sent by the gods to sting the city, to wake it up, to irritate it into life." It is a funny, humble, and slightly annoying image. A gadfly is a pest. It buzzes, it bites, it is easily swatted, but it keeps the horse moving. Plato realized that he didn't want to be the horse, grazing blindly in the field of custom and tradition. He wanted to be awake. The transformation was swift and dramatic. There is a famous story, perhaps apocryphal, but emotionally true, that shortly after meeting Socrates, Plato gathered all his tragic poems, the work of his youth, the vessels of his ambition, and threw them into a fire. "Come hither, Hephaestus," he whispered, invoking the god of fire. "Plato has need of thee." It was a ritual sacrifice. He was burning his vanity. He was burning the idea that he could write pretty lies about the gods. From that moment on, he would dedicate his pen to the truth, however ugly or difficult it might be. He became one of the Socratic Circle, a group of young men who followed the old philosopher around the city, much to the annoyance of their conservative fathers. They weren't a school. There was no tuition, no building, no curriculum. They were just a pack of intellectual hunters, stalking the truth through the gymnasiums and dinner parties of Athens. For Plato, this was the happiest time of his life. The war was over, the walls were down, and though the city was poor, the conversation was rich. He watched Socrates challenge the priests on piety, the politicians on justice, and the poets on inspiration. He learned that the most important phrase a human being can utter is, "I do not know." It was an intoxicating freedom. But as he followed the old man through the winding streets, laughing at the discomfort of the pompous elite, Plato could not see the storm clouds gathering. He did not yet realize that a city which has lost its empire and its pride has very little patience for a gadfly. He did not know that the stinging would eventually become too painful for the horse to bear. He was young, he was brilliant, and he had found his guide. The sun was shining on the agora, and for a fleeting moment, wisdom seemed like a game that could go on forever. But the shadows were lengthening, and the trial we witnessed at the beginning of our journey was drawing closer. Day by day, question by question, the silence that fell over Athens after Socrates drank the hemlock was not a peaceful silence. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of fear. For the young men who had sat at his feet, the Socratic Circle, the city they loved had suddenly transformed into a trap. The familiar streets of the agora, where they had once laughed and debated, now felt like the corridors of a hostile maze. There were whispers in the porticos, dark glances from the men who had voted for the execution. The mood turned paranoid. If the city could kill the master, what would stop them from crushing the students? Plato was roughly 28 years old, a man in his physical prime, but emotionally, he was shattered. The death of Socrates was not just the loss of a friend, it was the collapse of his moral universe. He had watched the democratic mob murder the most righteous man alive, and that sight burned a hole in his patriotism. He could no longer walk the streets of Athens and see glory. He saw only blood on the marble, and so the broad-shouldered wrestler, the aristocrat, the poet turned philosopher, did the only thing he could do. He ran. It was a flight born of necessity, a tactical retreat from a battlefield where reason had lost. We can imagine him packing his few belongings, perhaps a few scrolls, a heavy cloak, a sturdy pair of sandals, under the cover of night. He was leaving behind his family, his heritage, and the grave of his teacher. He joined a small group of fellow students, a band of philosophical refugees seeking sanctuary. Their destination was Megara, a city just a short journey west along the coast. Yet in the fractured politics of ancient Greece, it felt like a different world. Megara had been a bitter rival of Athens during the war, but now it offered the one thing Athens could not: safety. They were welcomed there by Euclid, not the famous geometer who would come later, but Euclid of Megara, a former student of Socrates who had founded his own school. There is a touching historical detail here. Euclid had risked his life during the war to sneak into Athens just to hear Socrates speak, disguising himself in women's clothing to bypass the guards. Now, he opened his doors to the frightened orphans of that philosophy. In Euclid's house, the refugees huddled together, licking their wounds. We can picture them sitting around a low wooden table, sharing wine and bread, their conversation oscillating between grief and furious debate. It is a scene of poignant humanity. These great minds, who would go on to shape Western thought, were, for a moment, just a group of scared young men missing their father figure. They argued over what Socrates had really meant, trying to reconstruct his arguments from memory, desperate to keep his voice alive in their heads. It was here, in the safety of exile, that Plato's anger began to cool into something harder, something more durable, a resolve to understand the world that could allow such an injustice to happen. But Megara was only the waiting room. Plato's soul was too restless to stay put. He needed distance. He needed to see the world from a vantage point where the shadow of the Parthenon did not reach. And so began one of the most mysterious and romantic chapters of his life, the Grand Tour. He became a theoros, a spectator, a traveler who journeys to see the sacred sites. He boarded a ship, leaving the familiar blue waters of the Saronic Gulf for the wider, darker Mediterranean. We must pause here to acknowledge the fog of history. The accounts of Plato's travels are a mix of fact and legend, woven together by later biographers who wanted to paint him as a sorcerer sage who had gathered the wisdom of the entire earth. Did he really travel for 12 years? Did he go as far as the banks of the Ganges? It is unlikely, but the core of the journey is true. He went looking for answers that Athens could not provide. Imagine him on the deck of a merchant vessel, the wind whipping his cloak, the taste of salt spray on his lips. He was no longer the wealthy Athenian nobleman. He was a stranger in strange lands, just another passenger sleeping on the wooden deck, wrapped in wool, watching the stars wheel overhead. There is a gentle irony to imagine Plato, who would later write about the ship of state and the need for a skilled captain, suffering the indignities of real sea travel, the lurching of the hull, the bad food, the smell of tar and unwashed sailors. Perhaps, as he leaned over the rail, feeling the green sickness of the sea, he realized that the physical world is indeed a chaotic, unstable place, just as he suspected. His first major destination was likely Cyrene, in North Africa, a Greek colony famous for its horses and its mathematicians. Here he sought out Theodorus, a brilliant geometrician. In Athens, Math was often seen as a practical tool for commerce or engineering. But with Theodorus, Plato began to see it as a language of the divine. He watched as Theodorus drew diagrams in the sand, proving the irrationality of square roots. It was a revelation. In the clean, absolute certainty of mathematics, Plato found the antidote to the messy, subjective world of Athenian politics. In a courtroom, a man can be talked into death by a clever speech. But in geometry, a triangle is a triangle, and no amount of persuasion can change the sum of its angles. It was safe. It was eternal. It was true. This love affair with geometry would become so central to his life that years later, he would supposedly inscribe above the entrance to his academy, "Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here." It wasn't about being good at sums. It was about training the mind to see the unseen structures of reality. From Cyrene, the currents of curiosity pulled him deeper into the ancient world. He moved south and east toward the great river civilization that had stood for thousands of years while Greece was still a collection of mud huts. He went to Egypt. To the Greeks, Egypt was the land of deep time, a place of magic and monumental stillness. Plato traveled to Heliopolis, the city of the sun, and Memphis, walking in the shadow of the great pyramids, which were already ancient in his day. He engaged with the Egyptian priests, men with shaven heads and linen robes, who looked at the young Greek with a mix of amusement and condescension. There is a famous anecdote, preserved in his later dialogue, Timaeus, where an Egyptian priest tells Solon, and by extension Plato, "O Solon, Solon, you Greeks are always children. There is no such thing as an old Greek." The priest meant that the Greek memory was short, constantly wiped clean by disasters, and lacking the deep, recorded history of the Nile. This sting must have resonated with Plato. He felt the immaturity of his own culture, the chaotic youthfulness of Athens compared to the rigid, unchanging stability of Egypt. In Egypt, art didn't change for centuries. Laws were carved in stone. Society was a fixed hierarchy. To a man fleeing the chaos of democracy, this permanence must have felt seductive. He walked the temple complexes, smelling the incense of frankincense and myrrh, observing a society where everyone knew their place. He didn't want to copy Egypt. He found their rigidness stifling, but he admired their seriousness. He saw that a society could be designed, engineered like a pyramid to last forever. As he wandered along the banks of the Nile, watching the ibis birds step delicately through the reeds, the blueprint of his republic began to form in the back of his mind. He began to dream of a city that combined the intellectual freedom of Athens with the stability of Egypt, a city ruled not by the mob, but by the wise. He was gathering the bricks for his fortress of reason, one by one, from the dust of foreign lands. But he was not done yet. The East had given him history and stability. The South had given him mathematics. Now, he needed to turn west, to Italy, where a mystical cult of philosopher-scientists was guarding a secret about the music of the universe. The wrestler from Athens was about to learn that the soul, like a lyre, could be tuned. He boarded another ship, turning his back on the Sphinx, ready to listen to the song of the spheres. The ship leaves the restless, frothing waves of the Mediterranean and enters the brown, sluggish embrace of the Nile Delta. The water here is not the sparkling azure of the Aegean. It is thick, opaque, and teeming with life, carrying the silt of a continent. We are arriving in Egypt, the land of the Black Earth, Kemet. For Plato, stepping off the wooden gangplank onto the muddy banks of Naucratis, the Greek trading port, must have felt like stepping onto another planet. The air is heavier here, draped in a humidity that smells of baking clay, lotus flowers, and the ancient, sweet decay of the river reeds. The light is different, too. The sun is a relentless, unblinking white eye that bleaches the color from the world, demanding submission. He travels south, deeper into this strange, vertical kingdom, toward Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Imagine the visual shock for an Athenian. In Athens, the buildings are human scale, designed to celebrate the individual. Here, the scale is crushing. He walks past statues that rise 60 feet into the air, stone pharaohs with eyes fixed on eternity, their hands resting on knees that are wider than a chariot. The message is clear. The individual is nothing. The system is everything. This is a civilization that has not changed its art style in 2,000 years, a concept that must have been both terrifying and deeply seductive to a man fleeing the political chaos of Greece. Plato is here to learn from the priests, the keepers of the deepest archives in the world. We can picture him in the cool, dim recesses of a temple, perhaps the great temple of Ra, where the sunlight is filtered through narrow slits in the stone, creating beams of dust-mote gold in the darkness. He sits across from a priest whose head is shaved smooth as a river stone, wearing linen so white it seems to glow. The language barrier is bridged by interpreters, or perhaps Plato's own struggling command of the tongue. But the ideas need no translation. It is here that the famous accusation, which we touched upon as he departed, truly sinks into his soul. You Greeks are children, the priest says, his voice dry as parchment. You have no antiquity of history and no history of antiquity. He explains that while Athens is constantly destroyed by floods and wars, forgetting its past and starting over like an infant, Egypt remembers. They have the records. They know the cycles of the stars, the rise and fall of dynasties that predate the Greek gods. This concept of deep time hits Plato with the force of a revelation. He realizes that Athens is just a blip, a momentary flicker of noise. He begins to crave this Egyptian stability. He looks at their social structure, a rigid pyramid with the laborers at the bottom, the warriors in the middle, and the priest-kings at the top. Everyone stays in their lane. The son of a shoemaker becomes a shoemaker. There is no chaotic democracy, no mob voting to kill the wise. It is a machine for social peace. Historians have long debated the extent of this influence, but it is impossible to read Plato's Republic, with its strict three-class system of producers, auxiliaries, and guardians, without seeing the shadow of the Nile. He didn't want to be Egyptian, but he wanted their permanence. Yet there is a mystical element here, too, one that would seep into his later myths. The Egyptians were obsessed with the afterlife, with the weighing of the heart against the feather of truth. In Athens, the afterlife was a shadowy, dismal place where confused ghosts fluttered like bats. In Egypt, it was a moral courtroom. The soul was immortal, and it was judged. This idea of the immortal, judgeable soul would become the cornerstone of Plato's ethics. He spent months, perhaps years, absorbing this heavy, static wisdom. He likely heard the myth of Thoth, the ibis-headed god who invented writing. There is a delicious irony here that Plato would later use in his dialogue Phaedrus. The Egyptian king Thamus rebukes Thoth, saying that writing will not make people wiser, but more forgetful, because they will trust external marks rather than their own internal memory. even as Plato scribbled notes on papyrus, buying scrolls to take home. He was wary of the written word, remaining true to Socrates' distrust of dead text. We can imagine him walking by the river at dusk, watching the sun vanish into the western desert, the land of the dead, and seeing the first stars emerge. The Egyptians taught that the stars were the souls of the gods. Plato began to connect the dots, the perfect math of the stars, the immortal nature of the soul, and the need for a changeless society. The heat of Egypt baked these ideas into bricks that he would later use to build his own philosophy. But the Nile could not hold him forever. It was too heavy, too slow. He was still a Greek, and he missed the spark of dialectic, the friction of argument. He had learned about the one, the unified, unchanging order, but he needed to understand the many. He needed to understand how the perfect numbers of the universe actually connected to the messy human soul. And for that, he didn't need priests. He needed a cult. He needed the mystics who lived in the heel of Italy, the followers of a man who could supposedly talk to animals and remember his past lives. Plato packed his scrolls, his head full of pyramids and judgment halls, and turned his gaze towards the setting sun once more. The silence of the desert had healed him, but the music of the spheres was calling. He boarded a ship bound for Tarentum, ready to trade the stone of Egypt for the mathematics of the soul. The keel of the ship cuts through the Ionian Sea, leaving the heavy, ancient stillness of Egypt behind. The air changes as Plato sails west. It becomes sharper, brighter, smelling of pine resin and the wild herbs that cling to the rocky coasts of southern Italy. He is heading for Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, a collection of colonies that are richer, flashier, and more eccentric than the motherland. He steps ashore in Tarentum, a thriving port city where the intellectual climate is electric. If Athens was the city of words and Egypt the land of stone, then Italy is the realm of numbers. He has come to find the Pythagoreans. By this time, the great master Pythagoras has been dead for decades, but his followers have formed a powerful, secretive brotherhood that dominates the politics and culture of the region. They are a strange mix of scientist, monk, and politician. They live by a code of silence, they wear white linen, and they follow a dizzying array of dietary taboos. Most famously, the strict prohibition against eating beans. Historians still debate the reason for this vegetable vendetta. Was it because beans looked like embryos? Or perhaps because, as some cheeky ancient sources suggest, they caused a flatulence that disturbed the concentration needed for high philosophy. It is a small, humanizing detail that reminds us these seekers of cosmic truth were also men navigating the awkward realities of digestion. But Plato ignores the eccentricities because he is captivated by their central, earth-shattering idea. All is number. His host and guide in this new world is Archytas of Tarentum. Archytas is a man who must have seemed like a hallucination to Plato. He is a brilliant mathematician who solved the problem of doubling the cube. He is a general who was elected commander-in-chief 7 times and never lost a battle. And he is a kind, benevolent ruler. Here, finally, is the living, breathing proof that power and wisdom can coexist. Archytas is the prototype for the philosopher king that Plato will later dream of in the Republic. We can imagine the two men walking along the ramparts of Tarentum, the soldier scholar and the wrestler poet, discussing how to govern a city using the laws of harmony. It is in the lecture halls of Tarentum that Plato undergoes his second great intellectual conversion. The Pythagoreans sit him down in front of a monochord, a simple wooden box with a single string stretched across a movable bridge. They invite him to pluck it. The sound rings out, a clean, vibrating note. Then they move the bridge to the exact halfway point and pluck it again. The note is the same but higher, an octave. They move it to 2/3, a perfect fifth, 3/4, a perfect fourth. This is the moment the universe unlocks. Plato realizes that the most beautiful thing in the world, music, which moves the soul to tears, is actually just hidden arithmetic. The interval is a ratio, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4. The chaos of sound is governed by the rigid, invisible laws of integers. If music is math, and the soul loves music, then the soul must be structured by math. This realization hits Plato with the force of a religious awakening. It bridges the gap between the physical world he distrusts and the intellectual world he craves. The messy physical string is just a vessel. The truth is the ratio, the invisible number that exists even if the string snaps. Here, the theory of forms begins to crystallize. Plato starts to see that everything in the physical world is just a poorly tuned instrument trying to play the perfect song of mathematics. A physical circle drawn in the sand is never perfect. It has bumps and thickness. But the idea of the circle, the mathematical definition, is flawless, eternal, and divine. The Pythagoreans teach him to listen to the silence. They tell him about the music of the spheres, the idea that the planets, as they rush through the heavens, hum with specific pitches based on their speeds and orbits, creating a cosmic symphony that we cannot hear simply because it has been playing since the moment of our birth. We are like fish, unaware of the water. This poetic image of a singing universe seeps deep into Plato's imagination. It offers him a vision of a cosmos that is not a random accident, but a carefully tuned orchestra conducted by a divine intelligence. But the Italians have one more secret to share, one that is darker and more personal than geometry. They teach him about the soul's journey. Drawing on the misty shamanic traditions of Orphism, they believe that the body is a tomb. Soma is Sema. They teach metempsychosis, or the transmigration of souls. In Athens, death was a fading away. Here, death is a door. The Pythagoreans whisper that the soul is older than the body. It has lived before, perhaps as a king, perhaps as a beggar, perhaps, if one was particularly wicked, as a wolf or a pig. Life is a penitentiary where the soul is sent to learn its lesson, to purify itself through philosophy and math, so that it might eventually escape the cycle of rebirth and return to the stars from which it came. This connects with the Egyptian judgment he learned earlier, but it adds a cycle of hope and responsibility. Learning is not discovering something new. It is anamnesis, remembering what the soul knew before it was born. When Plato watched a boy solve a geometry problem in the sand, he wasn't watching a student learn. He was watching a soul remember its divine origin. We can picture Plato sitting on the rocky cliffs of Tarentum, looking out over the wine-dark sea at sunset. He is changing. The angry young refugee who fled Athens is gone. He is being filled with a strange, cool serenity. He now has the pieces of his puzzle. Socrates gave him the ethical drive, the search for the good. The Egyptians gave him the sense of deep time and judgment. And now the Pythagoreans have given him the structure, the mathematical ladder to climb out of the cave. He sees now that the job of the philosopher is not just to annoy people in the market, as Socrates did. It is to save his own soul. It is to tune the instrument of his mind until it resonates with the harmony of the universe. He spends long days with Archytas, likely discussing the mechanics of the universe. Archytas was not just a mystic. He was an engineer who supposedly built a mechanical wooden pigeon that could fly, powered by steam, the world's first robot. This blend of high mysticism and practical engineering delights Plato. It reinforces the idea that if you understand the laws of nature, you can master nature. But peace is a fleeting visitor in Plato's life. Just as he is settling into this Pythagorean paradise of numbers and olives, a message arrives. It is a letter from Sicily, from the great city of Syracuse. It is an invitation that appeals to the very ambition he thought he had buried. A young admirer named Dion has written to him. Dion is the brother-in-law of Dionysius I, the tyrant of Syracuse. The letter is full of flattery and hope. It suggests that the tyrant, a man known for his brutality and power, might be open to philosophy. It hints that perhaps, just perhaps, Plato could come and do for Syracuse what Archytas has done for Tarentum. He could mold a tyrant into a king. It is the siren song of political relevance. The gadfly instinct wakes up. Why stay here in the quiet lecture halls of Italy, preaching to the converted, when he could go to the most powerful city in the Western Greek world and test his theories in the real fire of politics? Archytas warns him. He knows Dionysius. He knows that tyrants are not like triangles. They do not follow logical rules. But Plato is seduced by the possibility of the Republic coming to life. He packs his scrolls, his geometry, and his hope. He says goodbye to the gentle mathematician Archytas and boards a ship for the short, dangerous crossing to Sicily. He is sailing towards the volcano. Both literally, Mount Etna looms over the island, and metaphorically. The wrestler is stepping back into the ring, but this time his opponent is not a boy in the sand, but a monster on a throne. The transition from the quiet, dusty calm of Tarentum to the city of Syracuse was like stepping from a library into a foundry. As Plato's ship glided into the great harbor, he wasn't just entering another Greek city. He was entering the powerhouse of the Western Mediterranean. Syracuse in 388 BC was a monster of a metropolis, richer than Athens, stronger than Sparta, and ruled by an iron fist. The air here didn't smell of old parchment or olive groves. It smelled of pitch, timber, and the metallic tang of fresh forged weapons. The harbor was choked with triremes, the great warships of the tyrant's navy, bobbing like a pack of wolves on a leash. This was the domain of Dionysius I, a man who had turned the entire city into a personal fortress. For Plato, the idealist who believed that cities will have no rest from evils until philosophers become kings, this was the ultimate laboratory. He wasn't here to sightsee. He was here to perform a grand experiment. He believed he could graft the delicate shoot of wisdom onto the gnarled, violent root of tyranny. He was welcomed not by the tyrant himself, but by the man who had invited him, Dion. Dion is one of the most tragic and compelling figures in Plato's life, a young man of striking beauty and severe intelligence. He was the brother-in-law of the tyrant, living in the dangerous inner circle of the court. Yet his soul was starving for something more than court intrigue and gluttony. When he met Plato, it was a collision of destinies. Dion drank in Plato's words as if they were water in a desert. He abandoned the luxurious, dissolute lifestyle of the Sicilian nobility, famous for their Syracusan tables, groaning with rich food, and embraced the austere virtue of the philosopher. For Plato, Dion was the proof of concept. If this young aristocrat could be turned toward the light, then perhaps the tyrant himself could be saved. But then Plato met the tyrant. Dionysius was a fascinating nightmare of a human being. He was a self-made man who had risen from a lowly clerk to the master of Sicily through sheer ruthlessness and military genius. He was a poet who wrote terrible verses, a warrior who fought Carthage to a standstill, and a paranoid wreck who saw assassins in every shadow. History serves us a grimly humorous detail about his paranoia. It is said that Dionysius was so terrified of being reviewed by a razor that he would not let a barber touch him. Instead, he forced his own daughters to singe his beard off with hot walnut shells. Imagine the scene: the most powerful man in the West, sitting in his golden palace, smelling of burnt hair, terrified of a piece of sharp metal. This was the man Plato hoped to turn into a sage. The collision was inevitable. Plato was granted an audience in the tyrant's fortified palace on the island of Ortygia. We can picture the scene: the rough, scarred warlord lounging on a couch draped in Tyrian purple, surrounded by mercenaries, and the calm, broad-shouldered Athenian philosopher standing before him, refusing to be intimidated. Dionysius, perhaps amused by this famous intellectual, asked him questions. But he didn't ask about geometry or the soul. He asked about happiness and power. He wanted validation. He wanted the wisest man in the world to tell him that he, the tyrant of Syracuse, was the happiest of men because he possessed absolute power. Plato, true to the memory of Socrates, refused to lie. He looked the tyrant in the eye and dismantled his life's work. He argued that the tyrant, far from being happy, is the most miserable of all creatures. The tyrant is a slave to his own fears, trapped in a prison of his own making, unable to trust a single friend, forever looking over his shoulder. True power, Plato argued, was self-mastery, not mastery over others. To a room full of sycophants who spent their days flattering the king, these words must have sucked the oxygen out of the air. It was a stunning act of bravery, or perhaps a stunning lack of survival instinct. It was the gadfly stinging the bull. But this bull had horns of steel. Dionysius listened, his face darkening like a thunderhead. He was used to poets praising his bad verses, not philosophers pitying his soul. The tension in the court ratcheted up. Dion, standing off to the side, must have been sweating, watching his beloved teacher walk the razor's edge. The conversation turned to the nature of justice. Plato declared that a man who does injustice is wretched, even if he is never caught or punished. He argued that it is better to suffer wrong than to do it. For a warlord who had built his empire on betrayal, execution, and conquest, this was not just an insult, it was treason. It delegitimized his entire existence. The explosion finally came. Dionysius, unable to win the argument with logic, resorted to the only tool he truly understood: violence. "Your words," he sneered, spitting the insult across the marble floor, "are the words of an old dotard." He was calling Plato a senile old fool. The court likely held its breath, waiting for the philosopher to apologize, to bow, to beg. But Plato, the wrestler who had faced Socrates' questions and the Atlantic's waves, stood firm. "And your words," he replied calmly, "are the words of a tyrant." It was a mic drop echoing across millennia. But in 388 BC, it was a death sentence. The meeting ended abruptly. Plato was dismissed, not just from the room, but effectively from the sphere of the tyrant's protection. The experiment had failed. The philosopher king was a fantasy. The reality was an angry man with an army. Dion, terrified for his friend's life, scrambled to arrange an exit. He managed to get Plato onto a Spartan ship, a trireme commanded by a captain named Polus, which was carrying an ambassador back to Greece. It seemed like a narrow escape. Plato was leaving Syracuse with his life, leaving behind a heartbroken Dion and a fuming tyrant. But the anger of a tyrant has a long reach. As the ship slipped out of the great harbor, passing the looming shadows of the fortifications, Plato might have felt a sense of relief, watching the volcano recede into the distance. He did not know that a whisper had been passed from the palace to the captain of the ship, a secret order. Dionysius was not content to simply let the man who humiliated him walk away. He wanted to break him. The dotard had spoken about the freedom of the mind. Very well. Let him see how much that freedom is worth when the body is in chains. The ship did not head for Athens. As they sailed across the Ionian Sea, the course shifted north toward the island of Aegina. Aegina was, at that moment, at war with Athens. By decree, any Athenian caught on the island could be executed or sold into slavery instantly. Plato, the aristocrat, the scholar, the man who had communed with Egyptian priests and Italian mystics, was about to be stripped of his name and his rights. He was about to become a piece of merchandise. The golden cage of Syracuse had been left behind, only to be replaced by the iron shackles of a prisoner of war. The lesson of the physical world was about to be hammered home. Without the protection of law, even the wisest man is just meat in the market. The ship did not sail into the friendly, bustling harbor of Piraeus, as Plato expected. Instead, it lurched toward the rocky, hostile coast of Aegina. The sky was likely gray and overcast, mirroring the grim realization settling in Plato's gut. The captain, Polus, a Spartan, with eyes as cold as the Eurotas River, had followed his secret orders to the letter. He wasn't ferrying a passenger. He was delivering cargo. As the wooden hull scraped against the unfamiliar dock, the shouting began. Rough hands seized the philosopher. The fine cloak of Milesian wool was likely torn or stripped away. In an instant, the broad-shouldered aristocrat, the descendant of kings, the student of Socrates, was dragged onto the stones, not as a guest, but as a prisoner of war. Aegina was a death trap for an Athenian. The island was locked in a vicious, bloody conflict with Athens, and the local law was brutal in its simplicity. Any Athenian found on Aeginetan soil was to be executed on the spot. Plato stood on the precipice of death for the second time in his life. He was brought before the local magistrate, a man perhaps tired of killing, or perhaps seeing something in the prisoner's demeanor that gave him pause. The story goes that a reprieve was granted, or perhaps a cruel joke was played. The magistrate decided not to kill him, but to strip him of his humanity instead. He ordered Plato to be taken to the slave market. Close your eyes and try to imagine the sensory violence of that moment. The slave market of Aegina was a place of dust, flies, and the smell of fear. It was the absolute bottom of the social pyramid Plato had spent his life analyzing. He was made to stand on a raised block of stone, exposed to the critical, measuring eyes of buyers. These were men looking for strong backs to work the fields, or clever hands to weave wool, or perhaps tutors for their dull children. They poked his muscles, the muscles built in the wrestling rings of his youth. They checked his teeth. They discussed his price as if he were a prize mule. This is the supreme irony of Plato's life, a twist of fate so sharp it feels like a literary device. The man who would write The Republic, constructing an elaborate hierarchy where the guardians rule and the lower classes serve, was now standing on the auction block, priced lower than a good horse. He was experiencing the cave, not as a metaphor, but as a reality. He was a shadow on the wall, powerless, owned by the physical world he so despised. Did he feel terror, rage, or did he retreat into that inner citadel of reason, watching the spectacle with a detached, grim curiosity, proving to himself that the body is just a cage for the soul? The auctioneer began his chant. The bids were shouted out in the harsh Eginetan dialect. What am I bid for this scholar? Strong shoulders, good for hauling or teaching. The price rose. It was a humiliating, terrifying cacophony. And then, amidst the shouting, a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't the harsh bark of a slave master, but a voice of cultured Greek, perhaps tinged with the accent of North Africa. I will buy him. The crowd turned. The man who spoke was Anacharsis of Cyrene. He was not a philosopher, not a politician, but a chariot racer, a man of speed and spectacle who happened to be in Aegina for the games or business. But he was also a man of culture who recognized the prisoner. He didn't see a slave. He saw the man who had debated the nature of virtue in the colonnades of Athens. He saw the genius of the age standing in chains. Anacharsis paid the ransom. The sum is disputed by historians. Some say 20 minas, others 30. But in that moment, the specific weight of the silver didn't matter. What mattered was the act. With a handful of coins, the chariot racer bought the philosopher. He stepped up to the block, likely cut the bonds himself, and looked Plato in the eye. You are free, he might have said. In a heartbeat, Plato was transformed back from a thing into a man. The relief must have been physical, a sudden unknotting of the stomach. But the story has a coda that is even more significant than the rescue. Plato's friends from Athens, perhaps Dion, who had heard of the kidnapping and rushed to help, or other students, quickly gathered the money to repay Anacharsis. They approached the Cyrenian, holding out the heavy bag of silver, grateful but proud, wanting to settle the debt. Anacharsis refused. He waved the money away. The honor of saving Plato, he reportedly said, is payment enough. He refused to take a single drachma back. So there they stood, Plato and his friends, holding a large bag of silver that had no owner. It was a significant fortune, intended for a ransom that was no longer needed. What to do with it? They couldn't just spend it on wine or clothes. This was money that had been touched by death and redemption. It needed a purpose. They returned to Athens, the city Plato had fled 12 years earlier. He was 40 years old now. The anger of his youth had cooled into a steely determination. He was done with traveling. He was done with royal courts. He was done with the whims of tyrants and the chaos of the road. He wanted to build something permanent. He wanted to build a home for philosophy, a place where the search for truth would not be interrupted by executions or slave auctions. They walked out of the city walls, about a mile to the northwest, to a leafy green suburb called Academia. It was a sacred grove of olive trees dedicated to an obscure local hero named Hecademos. It was a quiet place, shaded by the silvery leaves of the sacred olives, watered by the Cephissus River. It had a gymnasium where young men trained and shrines to the Muses and Eros. Plato looked at the grove. He looked at the bag of silver in his hand, the ransom money. And he made a decision that would shape the next 1,000 years of human history. He used the money to buy a plot of land within the grove. He didn't build a fortress. He didn't build a temple. He built a school. But not a school as we know it, with desks and bells. He founded a community of friends living together in the pursuit of truth. It was called the Academy. Imagine the first day. There were no fanfares, no ribbon cuttings. Just Plato and a small group of devoted students walking into the olive grove, claiming it for the mind. They built a small shrine to the Muses. They built simple living quarters. They established a routine of walking, talking, and eating together. This was the first university in the Western world. Above the entrance, the famous warning was supposedly inscribed, "Geometretos medeis, eisito." Let no one ignorant of geometry enter here. It was a boundary line. Outside was the chaotic world of opinion, politics, and shadows. Inside was the world of proof, logic, and light. The Academy was a revolutionary space. It was, in a sense, an anti-Athens. In the city, men shouted over each other in the assembly. In the Academy, they took turns speaking. In the city, power was determined by votes. In the Academy, authority came from the better argument. It was a safe harbor where the gadfly could finally rest his wings and teach others how to sting. And so, the nightmare of the slave market birthed the dream of the university. The silver that was meant to buy a man's body instead bought a space for the human mind to expand forever. Plato settled into the grove, the leaves whispering above him like the voices of the Muses. He picked up his stylus. The traveling was over. The writing was about to begin. He was ready to construct the greatest edifice of all, not of stone, but of words. He was ready to write the Republic. The olive trees of the Academy were not merely plants. They were sentinels. Their gnarled, twisted trunks, grey as old stone, had stood for generations, their roots drinking from the same soil where the legendary hero Hecademos was said to be buried. When the wind blew through the grove, the silver-backed leaves shimmered like a sea of coins, whispering secrets to those quiet enough to listen. We are now about a mile outside the walls of Athens, in a leafy, sacred park that feels a world away from the sweaty, shouting marketplace where Socrates once roamed. This is the Garden of Heroes, the place where Western education was born, not with a bang, but with a conversation in the shade. Plato is no longer the wandering exile or the traumatized student. He is 40 years old, the scholar, the head of the school. He has found his harbor. The Academy is often called the first university, but we must banish the image of lecture halls, exams, and tuition fees. It was something far more intimate and religious. A theasos, a confraternity dedicated to the worship of the Muses. The tuition was a shared commitment to the truth, and the campus was a public park where anyone could walk, though only the initiated could truly understand the debates echoing off the gymnasium walls. Life here was a carefully choreographed dance of the mind and body. The day likely began early, with the sun filtering through the leaves. The curriculum was rigorous, designed to break the students' reliance on their senses and force them to see with their minds. They didn't just read poetry, they studied harmonics, astronomy, and above all, the sacred geometry that Plato had brought back from the Pythagoreans. There is a wonderful scholarly tradition that suggests Plato didn't just lecture. He posed challenges. He would set a problem for the school, save the appearances, for example, regarding the erratic movement of the planets, and the students would disperse, walking alone or in pairs under the trees, wrestling with the math until they could return with a solution. It was a collaborative hunt for reality. And who were these hunters? They came from all over the Greek world, drawn by the magnet of Plato's fame. There was the brilliant mathematician Eudoxus, who would later map the stars. There was the chaotic, brilliant nephew of Plato, Speusippus. But perhaps the most fascinating figures in the garden were two students who shouldn't have been there at all. History whispers the names of Axiothea, of Phlius, and Lastheneia, of Mantinea. They were women in the fiercely patriarchal world of ancient Greece, where women were largely confined to the domestic sphere. These two were so hungry for philosophy that they reportedly dressed as men to attend Plato's lectures. Some sources suggest Plato knew and permitted it. Others say it was a secret. But their presence is a testament to the radical nature of the academy. Inside these walls, the mind had no gender. It was a sanctuary where the only requirement was the ability to think. The heart of the academy, however, was not the classroom, but the dinner table. The syzygia, or communal meal, was where the real work happened. We can picture the scene: simple food, figs, olives, bread, watered wine, served on earthenware plates. Plato presided, not as a tyrant, but as a conductor. He was famous for his moderation. A visiting ambassador once dined at the academy and woke up the next morning feeling clear-headed and refreshed, remarking, "Plato's dinners are pleasant, not only when one is eating them, but also the morning after." It was a soft joke, but it carried a sharp point. At the academy, pleasure was not about excess. It was about balance. The conversation at these dinners would spiral into the night, exploring the nature of love, the definition of courage, or the structure of the soul. It was here, amidst the breaking of bread, that the dialogues we read today were likely first performed or tested, scripts for a theater of the mind. This brings us to a crucial shift in Plato's life. For years, he had honored Socrates' refusal to write. But now, in the quiet stability of the grove, Plato began to pick up the stylus. He began to transform his memories of the old gadfly into art. He didn't write dry treatises. He wrote plays where Socrates was the hero. Why? Historians argue endlessly about this. Was he trying to preserve the true Socrates? Or was he using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own developing theories? The answer is likely both. In the early days of the academy, the Socratic dialogues were likely used as teaching tools, scripts for the students to read aloud, forcing them to step into the shoes of the debaters, to feel the frustration of the elenchus from the inside. But as the years passed, the Socrates on the page began to change. He became less of a confused questioner and more of a confident teacher. He started talking about the immortality of the soul, the tripartite mind, and the perfect city. Plato was slowly, subtly stepping out from behind the mask of his master. He was becoming himself. The atmosphere of the academy was one of scholarly leisure, school in Greek, the root of our word, school. It meant freedom from the necessity of labor, freedom to think. But it was not a retreat from the world. It was a preparation for it. Plato's goal was not to create monks, but to forge leaders. He wanted to breed a new class of politician who would go back to their home cities, to Thrace, to Sicily, to Arcadia, and rule with wisdom. He was building a factory for philosopher kings. Yet, there was a gentle, human vulnerability to the scholarch. He was known to be reserved, perhaps even a bit melancholic. He never married. The family he built was intellectual, not biological. He lived in a small house within the garden, surrounded by his students, his books, and his geometry. There is a story that he had a severe sloping forehead and a quiet intensity that could be intimidating. A comic poet of the time poked fun at the academy students, describing them as pale-faced, barefoot, and arrogant, obsessed with defining the difference between a pumpkin and a turnip. Plato likely laughed at the jokes. He knew that to the outside world, they looked like oddballs, but he also knew that they were the only ones who were truly awake. While Athens chased money and power, the academy chased the eternal. As the sun began to set over the olive grove, casting long violet shadows across the walking paths, the students would gather for the final lecture of the day. The noise of the cicadas would rise, a rhythmic, buzzing chorus that Plato loved. He compared them to the servants of the Muses, who were once men so mesmerized by song that they forgot to eat or drink until they died and became insects. It is in this twilight setting, surrounded by the cicadas of his school, that Plato prepares to unveil his most famous and terrifying image. He looks at the students, their faces illuminated by the flickering oil lamps. He wants to explain to them why the world outside the grove is so hostile to the truth. He wants to explain why they killed Socrates. Picture men dwelling in a sort of subterranean cavern. He begins, his voice low and steady. The students lean in. The geometry lessons are over. The myth is about to begin. The shadows in the garden seem to lengthen, dancing on the walls of the academy, as Plato invites them to descend into the cave. The fire crackles in the hearth of the academy's dining hall, casting its own dancing shadows against the plastered walls, a visual echo of the story Plato is weaving. The students are silent, their wine cups forgotten in their hands. They are listening to the allegory of the cave, the centerpiece of his masterpiece, the Republic. It is a story so powerful that it will burn itself into the retina of Western consciousness, quoted by mystics, filmmakers, and revolutionaries for 2,500 years. But tonight, in the olive grove, it is fresh. It is not a cliché. It is a revelation. Plato asks them to imagine a deep, subterranean cavern. Inside, there are prisoners who have been chained there since childhood. Their legs and necks are fixed so they can only look forward at the back wall of the cave. They cannot turn their heads. Behind them burns a fire, and between the fire and the prisoners is a raised walkway, like a puppet show stage. Along this walkway, people, let's call them the puppeteers, carry objects, statues of men, animals, and tools made of wood and stone. The fire casts the shadows of these objects onto the wall in front of the prisoners. The prisoners see only the shadows. They hear the echoes of the puppeteers' voices bouncing off the wall and assume the shadows are speaking. For these prisoners, the shadows are not reflections. They are the world. They give them names. They award prizes to the man who is quickest to spot a passing shadow or predict which one will come next. They are masters of a two-dimensional illusion, completely unaware that a three-dimensional reality exists behind them. It is a terrifying image of the human condition. Plato is suggesting that we are all, by default, prisoners. The shadows are the things we obsess over: fame, social status, political power, the accumulation of wealth. We think they are real, but they are just fleeting silhouettes cast by the fire of opinion. The puppeteers are the politicians, the sophists, and the playwrights who manipulate public opinion, projecting false images to keep the masses docile and distracted. It is a biting social critique delivered with the calm demeanor of a bedtime story. But then, the story shifts. Plato asks, what if one prisoner were forcibly released? What if he were compelled to stand up, to turn his neck and look at the fire? It would hurt. The movement would be agonizing for muscles that have never been used. The light of the fire would dazzle his eyes, making him blind and confused. He would want to turn back to the shadows. The shadows were comfortable, familiar, and easy to see. The truth is painful, but suppose he is dragged by force up the rough, steep ascent, out of the cave and into the sunlight. This is the journey of education. It is not a gentle stroll. It is a violent dragging of the soul from darkness to light. When he finally steps out into the sun, he is completely blinded. He cannot see a single one of the things that are now said to be real. He has to look at reflections in the water first, then the objects themselves. And finally, after a long adjustment, he can look at the sun itself. The sun represents the form of the good, the ultimate source of all truth and beauty. He realizes that the sun is what makes the seasons, what allows life to exist, and what governs everything he used to see in the cave. He is finally awake. He pities his former cellmates. The prizes they give each other for guessing shadows seem ridiculous to him now, like children fighting over monopoly money. He would rather suffer anything than live like that again. And here, the story takes its darkest and most personal turn. This is the moment where Plato stops talking about abstract philosophy and starts talking about his dead teacher. He asks, what if this enlightened man went back down into the cave to free the others? He passes from the sunlight back into the gloom. His eyes, now used to the brilliance of the sun, are useless in the dark. He stumbles. He looks foolish. He cannot see the shadows anymore because he knows they are fake. The prisoners laugh at him. They say that his journey upwards has ruined his eyes. They say that going up is dangerous, and if he tried to unchain them and lead them up, they would get angry. They would say he is trying to destroy their reality. And if they could lay hands on the man who was trying to set them free and lead them up, Plato whispers, would they not kill him? The silence in the academy is absolute. Everyone knows who he is talking about. The man who came back, the man who looked clumsy in court, the man who was killed by the prisoners for trying to show them the sun. That was Socrates. The allegory of the cave is not just a metaphysical map. It is a grief-stricken defense of his teacher. It explains why the wisest man looked like a fool to the jury. It explains why the world hates philosophy, because philosophy disrupts the comfortable sleep of the ignorant. But the Republic is more than just this one story. It is a sprawling, ambitious blueprint for a perfect society, a Callipolis or beautiful city. In this city, everything is ordered by the form of the good. Plato divides the city into three classes, mirroring the three parts of the human soul. There are the producers, farmers, craftsmen, who correspond to the appetite. the auxiliaries, soldiers, who correspond to the spirit, and the guardians, rulers, who correspond to reason. It is a rigid hierarchy, and to keep it stable, Plato proposes a controversial idea that scholars still debate furiously today: the noble lie, or the myth of the metals. He suggests that the citizens should be told a myth that they were all born from the earth, and that the god mixed gold into the souls of the rulers, silver into the soldiers, and bronze and iron into the workers. It is a caste system based on merit, not birth. A gold child can be born to bronze parents and must be promoted, but it is a system based on a deliberate fiction. Is it manipulation? Or is it a necessary glue for a society that cannot handle the blinding truth of the sun? Plato seems to think that while the philosopher needs the truth, the city needs a myth. There are even deeper, stranger details in this utopia. Plato argues for the abolition of the nuclear family among the guardians. Wives and children should be held in common, so that no man knows his own son, and every elder is treated as a father. It is a radical attempt to destroy nepotism and private interest, forcing the rulers to love the city more than their own kin. One can almost hear the nervous shifting of the students as he proposes this, imagining a world without private homes or secret romances. It is the ultimate wrestler's move, grappling with human nature and trying to pin it to the mat of logic. But despite the authoritarian overtones that make modern readers uncomfortable, there is a profound beauty in Plato's vision. He is the first Western thinker to argue seriously for the equality of women, stating that if a woman has a gold soul, she should rule just as a man does. If we use women for the same things as the men, he says, with a touch of practical humor, we must give them the same education, even if it looks funny to see old women exercising naked in the gymnasium. It is a rare moment of levity, acknowledging that his ideas sound ridiculous to the conventions of his time. But he doesn't care about convention. He cares about the geometry of the soul. As the night deepens over the academy, the fire burns low. The shadows on the wall fade as the light dies. Plato has laid out the challenge. We are all in the cave. The screen you are looking at now, the news you consume, the opinions you hold, are they the sun? Or are they just pixels projecting shadows on the wall of your mind? The Republic is not a place on a map. It is a state of mind. It is the decision to turn around. But to find this city of truth, Plato sometimes had to go beyond logic. Sometimes, when the dialectic failed, he turned to the one thing the Greeks loved more than argument: a good story. And there was one story, one colossal myth of a lost civilization that he was saving for the end of his life, a story that would outlive even his philosophy. We drift now from the sharp, sunlit logic of the Republic into the mist-shrouded waters of legend. We are entering the twilight of Plato's writing career, a time when the philosopher, perhaps weary of abstract arguments, decided to build a world out of words that was so vivid, so tangible, that it would haunt the human imagination for the next 2.5 millennia. We are talking, of course, about Atlantis. It is a name that instantly conjures images of crystal towers, sunken temples, and advanced technology lost to the deep. But to understand the true weight of this story, we must forget the Hollywood movies and the New Age theories for a moment and return to the source. We are in the academy again, but the mood is different. Plato is writing 2 dialogues, the Timaeus and the Critias. He introduces a character named Critias, his own great-grandfather, who clears his throat and prepares to tell a story that is very strange but perfectly true. The hook is masterful. Plato claims this is not a fairy tale, but a piece of secret history brought back by the lawgiver Solon from his travels in Egypt. The very same travels we imagined Plato taking earlier. It is a brilliant literary device, grounding the fantastic in the authority of the past. The Egyptian priests of size, those keepers of deep time, supposedly told Solon about a great power that existed 9,000 years before. A power that dwelt beyond the pillars of Hercules in the Atlantic Ocean. Close your eyes and let Plato's description paint the picture on the back of your eyelids. He describes an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, a veritable continent of impossible wealth. This was not the austere, simple city of the Republic. This was a civilization drunk on luxury. He describes a city laid out in perfect concentric circles of land and water, 3 rings of water and 2 of land, connected by tunnels and bridges wide enough for a trireme to pass through. The walls were plated with metals, the outer with brass, the inner with tin, and the citadel itself flashed with the red fire of orichalcum, a mysterious metal second only to gold in value, mined from the earth of the island itself. It is a sensory feast. We smell the perfume of the wondrous woods and the scent of exotic fruits. We hear the trumpeting of elephants, which roam the island in great herds. We see the great temple of Poseidon, a structure so massive it makes the Parthenon look like a dollhouse, covered in silver, with pinnacles of gold, and inside, a statue of the sea god driving a chariot of 6 winged horses, so tall his head touches the roof. This is Plato, the artist unleashed. He is indulging in a kind of world-building that wouldn't be seen again until J.R.R. Tolkien. But why? Why would the man who despised the poets for telling lies create the biggest lie of them all? Historians and philosophers have argued about this for centuries. Some romantics still desperately search the seafloor for the lost city, convinced Plato was recording a literal memory of the Minoan eruption on Thera or some other catastrophe. But the scholarly consensus points to something far more interesting. Atlantis was not a history lesson. It was a dark mirror. In the Republic, Plato described the best city, virtuous, disciplined, and modest. Atlantis was the anti-Republic. It was a technological marvel, yes, but it was morally bankrupt. It represented everything Plato hated about the imperial Athens of his youth: the greed, the naval expansionism, the obsession with gold and luxury. The Atlanteans began as divine children of Poseidon, but over the generations, the divine element in their blood became diluted by mortal interbreeding. Human nature took over. They became unseemly, filled with avarice and unrighteous power. They ceased to be content with their paradise and began to wage war on the rest of the world, enslaved the peoples of the Mediterranean, and threatened to crush the ancestors of the Athenians. This is the punchline most people miss. The hero of the Atlantis story is not Atlantis. The hero is Athens, but not the Athens of Plato's day, a prehistoric, idealized Athens that stood alone against the might of the Atlantean Empire. It is a story of David and Goliath. The small, virtuous, disciplined city of Athens defeats the massive, bloated, technologically superior empire of Atlantis through sheer force of character. It is a warning disguised as a blockbuster. Plato is telling his students, look at this glittering empire. Look at its gold walls and its elephants. It is worthless because it lacks justice. And then, the catastrophe. The story tells us that after the war, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and the island of Atlantis, in like manner, disappeared in the depths of the sea. A single day and night. The phrase rings with the sudden violence of a door slamming shut. The great civilization is erased, leaving only an impassable shoal of mud in the ocean to mark its grave. It is the ultimate statement on the fragility of the physical world. All the orichalcum, all the engineering, all the naval power, gone in a heartbeat because they offended the moral order of the universe. There is a final haunting detail about this story that adds to its mystique. The dialogue Critias, which describes the luxurious details of Atlantis, cuts off in mid-sentence. Literally, Zeus, the king of the gods, sees the corruption of the Atlanteans and decides to punish them. He calls a meeting of the gods in his most holy habitation. He gathers them together, and he speaks. The text reads, "And when he had gathered them there, he said," and that is it. The rest of the page is blank. Did Plato die before he could finish it? Did he get bored and move on to the laws? Or, as some literary critics suggest, was the silence intentional? Perhaps the judgment of Zeus is too terrible to be written. Or perhaps Plato realized that the story was becoming too seductive, that he was making the evil city too beautiful, so he simply stopped the projector. We are left hanging on the edge of that cliff, listening to the silence of the gods. It is a fitting metaphor for the search for Atlantis itself, a story that promises a revelation and ends in a mystery. But while the ink was drying on this incomplete masterpiece, the real world was knocking on the gates of the Academy again. The lure of the philosopher king had not died. A message arrived from Syracuse. The old tyrant, Dionysius IV, was dead. His son, Dionysius II, was now on the throne. He was young, impressionable, and, according to Dion, eager to learn. It was the trap reopening. Plato was now in his 60s. He was the most famous intellectual in the world. He had his garden, his students, and his peace. He should have known better. He had written about the dangers of the cave, about the corruption of power, about the futility of helping those who do not want to see the light. But the dream of the Republic was a powerful drug. If he could just teach this young prince, if he could just implement the laws he had spent his life drafting, then maybe, just maybe, Atlantis wouldn't have to sink. Maybe a city could be saved. Dion begged him to come. Now, if ever, the letter urged, is the time to create a society where philosophy and power meet. Plato looked at his unfinished manuscript of Critias. He looked at the olive trees of the Academy. He must have felt the heavy pull of duty, the gadfly buzzing in his ear one last time. He sighed, packed his bags, and for the third time in his life, boarded a ship for the volcano. He was sailing back to the island of monsters, armed only with geometry and hope, unaware that the tragedy awaiting him would make the fall of Atlantis look like a children's story. The prow of the trireme slices through the Ionian Sea, but this time the water does not feel like a road to adventure. It feels like a heavy blue curtain being pulled back on a stage the actor had hoped never to tread again. Plato is 60 years old. His beard is grey, his joints ache in the damp sea air, and he is sailing back into the mouth of the volcano. Why? Why leave the peace of the olive grove, the adoration of his students, and the safety of Athens for the treachery of Syracuse. It is the burden of his own philosophy. He has written that the just man must rule if called upon, lest he be ruled by inferior men. Now, the call has come. To refuse would be to admit that his republic was just a paper dream, a fairy tale for intellectuals. He is going to prove that wisdom can tame power. He arrives in Syracuse in 367 BC, not as a prisoner, but as a celebrity. The reception is spectacular. The young tyrant, Dionysius II, sends a royal chariot to meet him at the harbor. The city is hung with garlands. The crowds cheer, hoping that this famous Athenian sage can bring a golden age to their war-weary island. But Plato, observing with the sharp, cynical eyes of a veteran observer, likely sees past the flowers. He sees the mercenaries sharpening their swords in the shadows. He sees the nervous glances of the courtiers. He knows that he is entering a nest of vipers, and his only weapon is a compass. Dionysius II is a fascinating study in wasted potential. He is not the iron-willed monster his father was. He is something perhaps more dangerous, a weak, spoiled child in a man's body. He has been kept in isolation for most of his life, barred from politics by a father who feared a coup, spending his days making little wooden furniture and drinking wine. He is desperate for approval, easily swayed, and possessed of a fragile, volatile ego. He doesn't want to be a philosopher. He wants to be seen as a philosopher. He wants the prestige of having Plato as a pet. For a brief, shining moment, however, it seems the experiment might actually work. The Plato effect sweeps through the palace like a fever. It is one of the most surreal images in ancient history, recorded by the biographer Plutarch with a mix of wonder and amusement. The royal palace on Ortygia, usually a place of drunken revelry and intrigue, is transformed into a makeshift university. The floors, once slick with spilled wine, are covered in a fine layer of dust or sand, the whiteboard of the ancient world. Imagine the scene: grim-faced mercenaries and soft-handed courtiers tiptoeing around geometric diagrams drawn on the floor, trying desperately not to smudge a theorem while pretending to understand the hypotenuse. The fashion of the court shifts overnight. Debauchery is out, geometry is in. Everyone is suddenly obsessed with triangles. It is a moment of gentle, almost slapstick humor. The killer trying to look like a scholar to please the boss. Plato, standing in the center of this absurdity, must have felt a flicker of hope. He begins the young tyrant's education not with politics, but with math. He believes that before you can rule a city, you must rule your own mind, and geometry is the discipline that orders the chaotic soul. But the honeymoon is fragile. The palace is not just a classroom, it is a battlefield. Opposing Dion and Plato is a faction led by Philistus, a historian and soldier who served the old tyrant. Philistus is the voice of realpolitik. He whispers into the young king's ear, dripping poison, drop by drop. "Why is this Athenian here?" he murmurs. "Why is Dion so close to him? They are not teaching you, my king. They are softening you. They want you to stare at triangles while Dion takes the throne." It is a classic wedge strategy, and Dionysius, insecure and paranoid, is the perfect victim. He begins to look at his uncle Dion not as a mentor, but as a rival. He looks at Plato not as a teacher, but as a conspirator. The atmosphere in the palace curdles. The geometry lessons become tense. The silence is no longer contemplative. It is heavy with suspicion. Then the trap springs. It happens with the sudden, arbitrary violence of a thunderstorm. A letter is intercepted, or perhaps forged, allegedly from Dion to the Carthaginians, discussing peace terms. It is thin evidence, but for a tyrant, suspicion is proof enough. Dionysius invites Dion to the palace for a walk near the sea. They stroll along the ramparts, the waves crashing below, the wind snatching their words. It looks like a reconciliation. But suddenly, the tyrant turns, his face twisting from friendship to fury. He produces the letter. He accuses Dion of treason. Before Dion can even defend himself, he is shoved onto a waiting ship and exiled to Italy. Plato is left alone. The philosopher-king experiment has lasted only a few months, and already the key architect is gone. Plato is now a guest who is also a hostage. He goes to the tyrant, demanding to leave. But Dionysius II is a complex captor. He doesn't want to kill Plato. He wants to own him. He is jealous of Dion. He wants Plato to say, "I love you more than him." He pleads, he cries, he offers gifts. It is a toxic, abusive relationship played out on a geopolitical stage. "Stay," the tyrant begs, "and I will give you anything. I will learn. I will be good." Plato, perhaps out of pity, perhaps out of fear, or perhaps because he still hopes to salvage the mission, agrees to stay for a while. He moves into the palace gardens, living in a gilded cage. He tries to continue the lessons, but the dynamic has shifted. It is no longer a teacher instructing a student. It is a prisoner entertaining a jailer. The geometry diagrams are swept away. The drinking parties return. The historical tragedy here is palpable. We see the clash between two incompatible worlds. The world of the idea, where truth is absolute and unchangeable, and the world of the tyrant, where truth is whatever the strongest man says it is. Plato is learning the hard way that you cannot teach philosophy to a man who thinks he already knows everything. Eventually, war breaks out elsewhere in the empire, distracting Dionysius. He allows Plato to leave, promising that he will send for him again when the war is over, and crucially, promising that Dion will be allowed to return then too. It is a face-saving lie for both of them. Plato boards the ship back to Athens, exhausted, humiliated, but alive. He returns to the academy, to the sanity of the olive grove, lightly swearing that he is done with politics forever. But history has a cruel sense of humor. The story of Syracuse is not over. The Game of Thrones has only just begun. Plato returns to his writing, diving into the laws, his final, most pragmatic work, where he abandons the ideal republic for a second-best city, ruled by rigid codes rather than wise men. It is the work of a disillusioned man. Yet a few years later, the letters start coming again. Dionysius II writes, he claims he has changed. He claims he has been studying. He invites Plato back. "Come," he says, "and I will recall Dion. If you do not come, Dion remains in exile." It is blackmail, pure and simple. Dionysius is holding Plato's best friend hostage to force the philosopher's return. Plato is now nearly 70. The thought of another voyage, another bout of seasickness, another season in the viper's nest must have been physically repulsing. But loyalty is the one virtue that Plato values above all. He cannot leave Dion to rot. And so, with a heavy heart and a sense of doom, the old man steps onto the boat one last time. He is not sailing for hope. He is sailing for duty. He is sailing into a trap that will nearly cost him his life. A final adventure that will strip away the last of his idealism and leave him facing the raw, naked face of tyranny without any philosophical armor. The third Sicilian adventure is about to begin, and the ghosts of the academy are whispering that this time he might not come back. The heavy iron gates of the citadel of Ortygia clang shut, a sound that echoes with the finality of a prison sentence. Plato is back in Syracuse, but the pretense of a royal visit has evaporated like morning mist under the Sicilian sun. It is 361 BC, and the philosopher is now nearly 70 years old. His joints are stiff, his patience is exhausted, and he finds himself trapped in a nightmare of his own making. The situation deteriorates with breathtaking speed. The young tyrant, Dionysius II, has not recalled Dion as promised. Instead, he has committed a betrayal so personal and so petty that it belongs in a soap opera rather than a history book. He has confiscated all of Dion's vast estates, selling them off to fund his own excesses, and in a move of calculated cruelty, he has forced Dion's wife, Arete, to divorce her husband and marry another man, a crony named Democritus. It is a violation of all sacred laws of family and honor. Plato, the man who wrote that justice is the health of the soul, is forced to watch this sickness unfold from the front row. He confronts the tyrant, his voice trembling not with fear, but with the righteous fury of a teacher whose student has failed the final exam. But Dionysius just smiles, that terrifying, vacuous smile. He doesn't want to hear lectures. He wants to be loved. This is the psychological horror of Plato's captivity. He is trapped with a man who is obsessed with him. Dionysius insists that Plato live in the palace, dining with him, walking with him, validating him. He is like a jealous lover who locks his partner in the house. "Do you love me more than Dion?" the tyrant asks, desperate for the approval of the great sage. It is pathetic and it is dangerous. When Plato tries to leave, the tyrant's mood snaps. He doesn't execute Plato. He does something more subtle and menacing. He moves the old philosopher out of the royal apartments and into the barracks of the mercenaries. Picture the scene. The most refined intellectual in the world, the man who spent his days in the quiet olive grove of the academy discussing the immortality of the soul, is now sleeping on a cot surrounded by the tyrant's personal bodyguards. These are not the citizen soldiers of Athens. These are Gauls, Thracians, and Iberians, hired killers who speak rough dialects and smell of garlic and stale wine. And they hate Plato. They know that in his republic, the guardians are supposed to live without gold or property, serving only the state. They know that this old man has been advising the tyrant to cut their pay and reduce their numbers. To them, he is not a philosopher. He is a threat to their livelihood. The air in the barracks is thick with unspoken violence. As Plato walks to the latrine or the mess hall, he feels the eyes of the soldiers tracking him, hears the sharpening of blades, the muttered insults. He is an old man alone in a wolf's den. He realizes, with a cold clarity, that he could be stabbed in his sleep, and no one would lift a finger. The philosopher king is a dead dream. The reality is a knife in the dark. He needs a miracle. He cannot appeal to Athens. Athens has no power here. He cannot appeal to Dion. Dion is in exile. He has only one card left to play, one connection that bridges the world of philosophy and the world of power. He remembers Archytas of Tarentum, the Pythagorean mathematician general we met years ago, the man who built the flying wooden dove. Plato manages to smuggle a message out of the fortress. We don't know how he did it. Perhaps a bribe to a sympathetic servant, or a note hidden in a basket of figs, but the message is desperate. "I'm in danger. It essentially says, the geometry has failed. Send the fleet. The waiting begins. Days turn into weeks. The summer heat of Syracuse turns the stone fortress into an oven. Plato sits in the shade of the barracks wall, watching the mercenaries cast dice, wondering if his life will end here, far from the grave of Socrates, a victim of his own hubris. He spends his time perhaps revising his notes, or perhaps just closing his eyes and retreating into the world of forms, the only place where justice still exists. And then a sail appears on the horizon. It is not a warship coming to burn the city, but a diplomatic vessel flying the colors of Tarentum. Archytas has come through. He hasn't sent an army. That would provoke a war that Tarentum might not win. But he has sent an embassy, led by a man named Lamiscus, armed with a letter that is a masterpiece of diplomatic pressure. The letter essentially says, "You promised us that Plato would be safe. We are the guarantors of that promise. If you want to keep the friendship of Tarentum, if you want our trade and our military alliance, you will let the philosopher go, now." It is a checkmate. Dionysius is a tyrant, but he is not stupid. He cannot afford to fight the powerful Pythagorean League of southern Italy. He is outmaneuvered by a mathematician. The tyrant summons Plato one last time. He feigns magnanimity, pretending that letting him go was his idea all along. He throws a farewell feast, a final display of the Syracusan table that Plato despises. There is a moment of dark comedy during the departure. As they are walking to the ship, Dionysius turns to Plato and says, with a sneer, "I suppose when you get back to the academy, you and your students will have a good time making fun of me and my philosophy." It is a moment of supreme insecurity. Plato stops. He looks at the tyrant, this man who has wasted so much time, money, and hope, and delivers a line that is as sharp as a scalpel. He smiles gently and says, "I hope, Dionysius, that we shall never be so short of subjects in the academy that we need to talk about you." It is the perfect philosophical insult. You are not even worth a footnote. With that, he walks up the gangplank. The oars splash into the water. The ship pulls away from the dock, leaving the island of monsters behind for the last time. As the fortress of Ortygia shrinks into the distance, Plato must have felt a profound, exhausting relief. He had survived the cave. He had gone down into the darkness to save the city, and he had barely escaped with his life. He leans against the rail, breathing in the clean salt air, washing the scent of the barracks from his lungs. He is done with kings. He is done with politics. He is going home to his garden. But the tragedy of Syracuse is not quite over. As Plato returns to Athens, he finds his friend Dion waiting for him. But this is not the gentle student of the past. This is a man consumed by a cold, hard rage. Dion has lost his wife, his home, and his honor. He listens to Plato's stories of the tyrant's treachery, and his eyes harden. He is done with philosophy too. He begins to gather mercenaries. He begins to buy swords. Plato watches with a heavy heart as his star pupil prepares to do the one thing the Republic was designed to prevent: plunge a city into civil war. The philosopher retires to his study, closing the door on the world of men, while the soldier marches off to kill. The dream of the philosopher king has died, and in its place, the dogs of war are slipping their leashes. The storm of Syracuse has finally passed, and the silence that settles over the academy is the deep, amber silence of late autumn. Plato is now an old man, entering his 70s. The broad shoulders that once wrestled in the sand are stooped, and the beard is long and white, like the moss that clings to the ancient oaks. He moves through the olive grove, not with the restless energy of the seeker, but with the slow, measured pace of the sage. He has survived tyrants, shipwrecks, and slave markets. And now he has returned to the only kingdom that ever truly mattered, the kingdom of the mind. But just as the sun begins to dip lower in his life, a new star rises in the northern sky, a star so bright and fierce that it threatens to outshine the master himself. In the year 367 BC, ironically, the same year Plato first left for Sicily, a 17-year-old boy named Aristotle walked through the gates of the academy. He was not a refugee like Plato had been. He was a colonial aristocrat from Stagira, up in the wild, rugged north, near Macedonia. He was the son of a court physician, and he brought with him the sharp clinical gaze of a doctor. He didn't come to learn how to die. He came to learn how the world worked. The arrival of Aristotle marks one of the most significant moments in the history of human thought, the meeting of the two tectonic plates upon which all Western philosophy rests. We often picture them as statues, frozen in marble agreement, but the reality was far more human, far more textured, and full of a gentle, inevitable friction. Aristotle was a bit of a dandy. Ancient gossip, which we must take with a grain of salt but enjoy for its flavor, whispers that the young Stagirite was something of a fashionista. He reportedly wore rings on his fingers, a flashy display for a philosopher, and kept his hair stylishly short, in contrast to the wild, unkempt manes of the other students. He spoke with a slight lisp, a vulnerability that perhaps made him work harder to be heard. But when he opened his mouth, the fashion disappeared, and the genius poured out. Plato, with his sharp eye for character, saw it immediately. He gave Aristotle a nickname. He didn't call him the Broad or the Wrestler. He called him the Reader, or sometimes the Mind of the school. This nickname, the Reader, is a fascinating historical breadcrumb. In a world where knowledge was still largely oral, where students learned by listening and debating, Aristotle was obsessed with scrolls. He collected them. He read them voraciously. He was the first great bookworm, a man who believed that knowledge could be catalogued, stored, and analyzed. The dynamic between the old mystic and the young scientist is the heartbeat of this era of the academy. Imagine them walking together under the plane trees. Plato points a trembling finger toward the sky, toward the invisible realm of the forms. He speaks of the idea of the horse, the perfect, eternal, divine blueprint of a horse that exists in heaven, of which all earthly horses are just pale, imperfect shadows. He is the man of the upward glance. Now look at Aristotle. He respects the master. He loves him, but he cannot help looking down. He looks at the ground. He sees a beetle crawling on a leaf. He sees the veins in the wing of a bee. He doesn't want to know about the idea of the bee. He wants to know how this bee flies. He wants to dissect it. He wants to categorize it. He is the man of the downward gaze. This fundamental difference, the idealist versus the realist, is immortalized in Raphael's famous fresco, The School of Athens, where Plato points up and Aristotle spreads his hand flat toward the earth. But in the garden, it wasn't a painting. It was a daily, affectionate argument. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but emotionally resonant, that Plato once compared Aristotle to a foal that kicks its mother after nursing. Aristotle kicks me, Plato is said to have joked, as foals do their mothers when they are born. It sounds harsh, but in the context of a teacher, it is the highest praise. The goal of every great teacher is to be surpassed, to be kicked by the strength of the mind they nourished. Plato knew that philosophy wasn't a cult of personality. It was a living fire. If the fire was to survive, it had to burn new wood. And Aristotle was burning with a different kind of fuel. While Plato was writing myths about Atlantis and the cave, Aristotle was inventing the rules of logic. He was obsessed with classification. He looked at the chaos of the world, the animals, the plants, the types of government, the parts of speech, and he tried to put them into boxes. He invented the syllogism, the logical equation that would rule science for 2,000 years. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. It is clean, dry, and undeniable. It lacks the poetry of Plato, but it has the sturdy reliability of a brick wall. Yet, despite their differences, there was deep love there. Aristotle stayed at the academy for 20 years. 20 years. You don't stay somewhere for 2 decades if you hate the boss. He stayed until Plato's death. He was the most brilliant student, but, and here is the sting of history, he was not the heir. He was an outsider, a metic, resident alien, and his ideas were perhaps too radical, too grounded for the mathematically obsessed leadership of the school. But for now, the tension is fruitful. We can imagine the old man sitting on a stone bench, watching the Stagirite hold court with the younger students, dissecting a squid to show its internal organs. A messy, smelly business that Plato probably found slightly repulsive but intellectually valid. Plato had spent his life trying to escape the physical world. Aristotle was diving headfirst into it. It was the closing of a circle. The academy had become large enough to hold both the sky and the earth. And as the shadows lengthened over the grove, Plato must have felt a strange sense of completion. He had built the fortress. He had defended it against tyrants. And now he had found the challenger who would test its walls. The stargazer could finally rest his eyes, knowing that the reader was there to catalogue the stars he had found. But the end was not quite yet. There was one final task remaining for the old master. He had one last book to write, a massive, dense, and practical confession that would strip away the poetry and leave only the law. The sun is setting on the golden age of Athens, and the old wrestler prepares for his final bout, not with a person, but with the imperfect reality of human nature itself. The sun is finally dipping below the horizon of the 4th century BC, casting the long, violet shadows of twilight across the white marble of Athens. In the quiet sanctuary of the academy, the air has grown cool and still. Plato is now an octogenarian, a man of 80 winters. The broad chest that once earned him his name has thinned, and the hands that once grappled in the wrestling ring now tremble slightly as they hold the stylus. He is almost deaf to the outside world, living in the muffled quiet of old age, but his mind remains a forge, burning with a final, desperate heat. He is working on his last testament, a massive, sprawling manuscript that lies in piles of papyrus around his small room. It is the Laws. If the Republic was the dream of a young lover, the Laws is the prenuptial agreement of a wise old lawyer. It is a book written by a man who has seen the abyss. He has seen the execution of Socrates. He has seen the chaos of the slave market in Aegina. He has seen the treachery of the tyrant's court in Syracuse. The fire of idealism has not gone out, but it has changed color, from the blinding white of perfection to the steady, warming embers of practicality. In this final phase, we see the most poignant transformation of the philosopher. He is no longer asking for the impossible. He is no longer waiting for a philosopher king to descend from the clouds. He has learned the hardest lesson of all, that men are not gods. Man is a fickle creature, he writes, perhaps thinking of Dionysius II, a plaything of the gods. He introduces a haunting metaphor in this final work. He describes human beings as puppets, jerked around by the hard iron strings of fear and pleasure. These strings pull us violently this way and that, making us dance a chaotic, jerky dance of sin and error. But amongst these iron wires, there is one soft golden cord. It is the golden cord of reason. It is gentle, it does not force, but it pulls us toward the good. The job of the law, he argues, is to help us hold on to that golden string when the iron wires are tearing us apart. There is a profound humility in this image. The wrestler admits that the fight is fixed. We are weak, and because we are weak, we cannot be trusted with absolute power. This is the seismic shift in his political thought. In the Republic, he argued that if you had a perfectly wise ruler, you didn't need laws, because the ruler would always know what is best, just as a doctor doesn't need a rule book to treat a patient. But now, after Syracuse, he knows that the perfect ruler is a myth. Power is a drug that intoxicates even the best men. Kronos, the old god, ruled a golden age, but we live in the age of iron. Therefore, since we cannot have a god as a king, we must make the law our king. Nomos, the law, must be supreme. He sketches out a new city. He calls it Magnesia. It is not the Callipolis, beautiful city of his youth. It is the second best state. It is a city of compromise. In this city, there are no wives held in common. The nuclear family is restored, but it is watched over by a vigilant state. There is private property, but it is strictly limited so that no one is too rich or too poor. It is a place of rigid moderation. It is fascinating to watch the old man obsess over the details. He becomes a micromanager of human existence. He writes laws about beekeeping, about the harvesting of figs, about traffic accidents, and even about how much wine can be drunk at weddings. Speaking of wine, there is a touch of the old man's humor, or perhaps his own coping mechanism, in the laws. He argues that while young men should abstain from wine because fire must not be added to fire, old men should be allowed to drink. He calls wine the cure for the crabbedness of old age, a gift from Dionysus that allows the elderly to feel young again, to soften their hard moods and join in the song. We can picture Plato, sitting alone in the evening light, sipping a cup of watered wine, feeling the warmth spread through his cold limbs, allowing himself a moment of grace. The structure of this final dialogue is also telling. Socrates is gone. The main character is no longer the gadfly of Athens. He is simply the Athenian stranger. It is a ghostly anonymity. The stranger is walking on the island of Crete, making a pilgrimage from the palace of Knossos to the cave of Zeus on Mount Ida. Note the symbolism. He is walking to a cave, but this time it is not a dungeon of ignorance. It is a holy sanctuary. He is walking with two other old men, a Spartan and a Cretan. They are discussing how to build a constitution. It is a slow, meandering conversation between geriatrics, full of digressions and memories. It feels like real time. It feels like a long walk on a hot day. But amidst the dry legal codes, there are flashes of the old mystical terror. Plato proposes a nocturnal council, a group of the wisest old men who meet before dawn while the city sleeps to study the stars and theology. They are the guardians of the state's soul. It is a slightly sinister, secretive image, a shadow government of philosopher priests. It reminds us that Plato never fully trusted the daylight of democracy. He always believed that the deepest truths were for the few, for the initiated, for those who could stay awake while the world snored. Historians and scholars often struggle with the laws. It is long, repetitive, and sometimes harsh. It prescribes the death penalty for atheism. It bans travel for young people so they won't be corrupted by foreign ideas. It sounds, to modern ears, like a police state. But if we listen closely, we don't hear the voice of a tyrant. We hear the voice of a grandfather who is terrified that his children will hurt themselves. He is trying to build a fence around the cliff edge. He is trying to build a system that can survive human stupidity. He is trying to save the appearances of a moral society in a world that seems determined to descend into chaos. As he writes the final scrolls, his eyesight failing, he must have felt the heavy weight of history. He had invented the university. He had defined the soul. He had challenged the tyrants. He had dreamed up Atlantis. But in the end, he comes back to the simple, unglamorous necessity of rules. He realizes that freedom without discipline is just a different kind of slavery. The Athenian stranger in the book says that we should live life as play. Not frivolous play, but serious play, like a religious ritual. We should sing, we should dance, and we should sacrifice to the gods, playing our part in the cosmic drama as gracefully as possible. Man is God's plaything, he repeats, and that is the best part of him. It is a surrender. The wrestler stops fighting the universe and decides to dance with it instead. He stops trying to force the world to be perfect and starts trying to make it functional. The scroll is nearly full. The ink is running low. Outside, the cicadas are singing their rhythmic, endless song, the song of the servants of the muses who forgot to eat. Plato lays down his stylus. He rubs his tired eyes. He has done what he could. He has moved from the fire of the sun to the light of the stars, and finally to the flickering lamp of the law. The journey of the mind is over. The journey of the soul is about to begin. The second best city is on paper. The best city is waiting for him in the place where Socrates has gone. He stands up, his joints popping in the silence, and walks to the window to look at the olive trees one last time. They are silver in the moonlight, eternal and silent. He is ready for the music to stop. He is ready for the feast. The wheel of time turns one last time, bringing us to the year 347 BC. The air in Athens is soft and fragrant, filled with the scent of jasmine and the distant, salty tang of the sea. It is a night of celebration. We are not in a prison cell, nor in a tyrant's fortress, nor in the dusty wrestling ring of his youth. We are at a wedding feast. It is a fitting setting for the final act of a man who spent his life trying to marry the human soul to the divine truth. Plato is 81 years old. He is a guest of honor, seated perhaps a little apart from the raucous energy of the young couple, watching the joy of the physical world with the benevolent detachment of a traveler who has already packed his bags for the next journey. The noise of the party is a pleasant hum, the clinking of wine cups, the laughter of friends, the rustle of fine garments. But Plato is tired. The broad shoulders are frail now, the weight of the years pressing down like the heavy stones of the Acropolis. He excuses himself from the table, not with a dramatic speech, but with a quiet nod. He retires to a couch in a quieter corner of the house. Or perhaps, as some legends suggest, he goes to his own simple room nearby, seeking the comfort of stillness. He lies down. The sounds of the feast drift through the window, softened by the distance. And then, a sound rises above the murmur. It is music. A Thracian girl, a flute player hired for the wedding, begins to play a melody. The notes float through the night air, simple and piercing. Even in his final moments, the reader, the mathematician, the lover of harmony, is listening. There is a touching, possibly apocryphal story that even as he lay dying, he tapped his finger against the wood of the couch, critiquing the rhythm, his mind seeking the perfect ratio until the very end. He is checking the tuning of the world one last time. It is such a Plato moment, rigorous, attentive, and deeply in love with order. But slowly, the critique fades. The finger stops tapping. The music of the flute merges with the music of the spheres that he learned about in Italy so many decades ago. The golden chord of reason that he wrote about in the Laws finally goes slack, not because it has broken, but because the puppet no longer needs to be pulled. He has cut the strings. He is free. Plato, the son of Ariston, the student of Socrates, the teacher of Aristotle, slips away into the good as quietly as a shadow, vanishing when the sun goes down. He dies not by hemlock, not by the sword, but by the gentle, natural expiration of a life fully used. The swan of Socrates' dream has flown. When the guests find him, he looks like he is merely sleeping, his face smooth, the furrowed brow of the philosopher finely relaxed. The news travels fast through the waking city. The academy mourns, but it does not panic. This is the greatest triumph of Plato's life. The institution survives the man. He didn't build a cult of personality. He built a machine for thinking. His nephew, Speusippus, takes over the leadership. Aristotle, perhaps feeling the sting of being passed over, or perhaps simply hearing the call of his own destiny, packs his scrolls. He will soon leave for Macedonia to tutor a wild young prince named Alexander, taking the spark of the academy and using it to set the world on fire. The lineage continues. Socrates taught Plato, Plato taught Aristotle, Aristotle taught Alexander the Great. In 3 generations, a conversation in a marketplace transformed into an empire that stretched to India. But the true miracle is not the empire of swords. It is the empire of words. Consider the sheer improbability of what happens next. The academy itself will stand for 900 years, longer than the Roman Empire, longer than the dynasties of Egypt he so admired. It becomes the lighthouse of the ancient world, flickering through centuries of war and change until the Emperor Justinian finally closes its doors in 529 AD. And even then, the light does not go out. The manuscripts, the Republic, the Symposium, the Phaedo survive. They are copied by monks in stone monasteries, translated by Arab scholars in Baghdad, and rediscovered by the Renaissance humanists in Florence. While the plays of his rivals were lost to rot and fire, while the statues of the tyrants crumbled into dust, almost every single dialogue Plato wrote has survived to reach your eyes. The man who distrusted writing became the most successfully preserved writer in history. It is the ultimate vindication of his theory of forms. The physical paper rots, but the idea is indestructible. As we stand over his grave in the garden of the Academy, where the dust of his body has long since returned to the soil to feed the olive trees, we realize that we are still living in his head. The British philosopher Alfred North Whitehead will later say that the safest general characterization of the European philosophical tradition is that it consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. It is a staggering thought. Every time we ask, what is justice? Every time we talk about ideal love, every time we imagine a perfect society, we are walking on the roads that he paved. He never found Atlantis in the ocean, but he built an Atlantis of the mind that has never sunk. The wrestler won his match. He pinned reality to the mat and forced it to reveal its secrets. And now the feast is over. The guests have gone home. The flute girl has packed away her instrument. The noisy, chaotic, beautiful, terrible democratic city of Athens sleeps. The gadfly is silent. The broad is at rest. The stargazer has become the star. The cycle is complete. The question that started our journey, the trauma of the hemlock, has been answered not with a counterattack, but with a creation. He answered death with immortality. He answered the cave with the sun. We have walked the long road from the prison cell of Socrates to the quiet garden of the Academy. We have sailed the stormy seas of Sicily and listened to the geometry of the stars. But now, the history book is closing. The scroll is rolled up and placed back on the shelf of memory. The olive trees of the grove are still, their silver leaves motionless in the moonlight. The arguments are over. The logic has faded into the soft, velvet silence of the night. You do not need to think anymore. You do not need to judge or analyze or remember. You are safe here in the sanctuary of the mind that Plato built, protected by the high walls of wisdom. Let the image of the ancient city fade, the white marble turning to gray, then to soft black. Let the voice of the philosopher become a whisper, then a breath, then nothing. The past is a dream, and you are drifting into your own peaceful darkness, floating on the river of time, weightless and free. Sweet dreams.